Hey everybody, this is Dean and welcome to Dino's Tech World. Today I thought I'd explain what LAMP, WAMP are and how web apps work. Alright, to start out with, LAMP, L-A-M-P, stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And it's the original kind of stack of applications on, or server applications on Linux that were used to make web apps, and they still are used to make web apps. But it's kind of a modular thing. And if we go over here and we look at what WAMP is WAMP is the exact same thing, except it uses Windows instead of Linux. And so what it comes down to is each of these components is kind of interchangeable to a certain level at least. And so what we have is an operating system that's kind of these apps are running on, and there's a web server, an SQL database, and a scripting language. And these three components underneath the operating system create a web application. So you'll notice here that under MySQL, there's also MariaDB, which is just a different version of MySQL, which is open source. The original creators of MySQL developed MariaDB because they wanted to ensure that it was always free and open source. And since even though MySQL is still free, it's commercially supported, so they wanted another fork of the same MySQL. So it's really the same thing. But you can actually replace any of these components in a web app with a different one. Now, with LAMP and WAMP, if you have a LAMP application, many times it will run on Windows if you're running Apache, MySQL, PHP, since you're running the same apps just under Windows. There are sometimes, depending on the app, some minor changes or tweaks that might have to be made to get a LAMP app to work on WAMP. But a lot of applications even that you can download that are open source will have been tested on both platforms. So they're fairly interchangeable most of the time. So if we go here and take a look at the typical setup on Linux, Linux was originally WAMP came after Linux because the apps originally were developed on Linux, and then they kind of moved over to Windows. And so Apache server, MySQL, and PHP all will run on either Linux or Windows. Now, as I said, these are like components, so we could replace very easily MySQL with the MariaDB because it's the exact same database. So it's just a different fork of it, a different kind of version of it, but they're compatible. They're very compatible. But you could actually use any SQL database in theory. The problem being is that if you use a different SQL database, even though SQL is a standard language, it's implemented slightly different on different databases, so you may run into some issues as far as that goes. So there may have to be some tweaks on that. That's also one of the tweaks between a LAMP and a WAMP application, because for example, even if you're using the same version of SQL between Linux and Windows, they may have certain things that are kind of operating system specific. For example, Linux and Windows handle time and date differently, so that actually affects sometimes the way SQL will work. So if we go back down here and we look at a Windows server now over to the right here, these apps, Windows kind of has its own stack for web apps, and by default, like the Microsoft stuff, if you're using Microsoft web apps, they're going to be using IIS, which is the default web server on Windows. They're going to be using Microsoft SQL database, which is kind of the default SQL database that Microsoft uses, and they'll be using APS.NET scripting language. So there are a lot of web apps and a lot of software that Microsoft uses these elements. In fact, a lot of the server software Microsoft creates in-house are made up of these components. And so when you have a web app, you have, of course, a web server always, and you have some sort of scripting language that dynamically creates pages, but many times you also have an SQL database, because once you have a scripting language and a database, you can take from the database with the scripting language, and so you can store things and you can retrieve things, and even though it might not strictly be a database application per se, or actually a lot of times, of course, it is a database application, you can use a database to store data for dynamic web pages or a web application of many different types. So you create a calendar application, which actually would be a database, but you'd be using a database in it to store, the events that are in the calendar, for example. You could also create an app where you needed to store some sort of user profiles, for example. So when it might not strictly be a database program, like if you wrote a messaging board or a bulletin board system or a forum system, as a web app, you could use SQL to hold user data, user logins, user profiles, but you could also use it to hold the messages. So you might not think of a forum or a message board as a database, but it is, because it's a database that's holding messages and posts that are linked to each other. So if we look at the WAMP version of a web server or a Microsoft kind of web apps, we might have Apache web server in here. We might have MySQL and PHP. That would be kind of the standard WAMP type of thing. But we can move some of these things. Often with WAMP, you can take just the regular IIS standard web server and get a WAMP application to work with that instead of setting up Apache. Part of the trouble you might run into is depending on how integrated the particular WAMP or LAMP application is with Apache. If the application really isn't using kind of things specifically to Apache, it might not be a problem, particularly if it's not using security passwords for, say, each user, for example. The other thing is that there are some specific things to Apache web server, and there may be plugins or other programs you can get so that they'll run with IIS. So you can make IIS in some senses look like Apache under certain circumstances. So that's a possibility. Other circumstances, the app may run it with either one fine. So that's something to be aware of. So any of these applications are interchangeable, but depending on how the web app was written, it might require some additional tweaking, or it might need a rewrite, depending on just how specific it is to the application. But the idea is that you can run any OS and a web server on that OS and an SQL server and a scripting language, and those components should be somewhat or very interchangeable. And with LAMP and WAMP, oftentimes they are, as I said, interchangeable, and oftentimes they are tested between both of them, or both systems, between Windows and Linux. So that's what LAMP is, WAMP is, and that's how web server apps work. I'm Dean, and this has been Dino's Tech World, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like.